Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 423. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on the show today, Connor. We got a lot to talk about. Just want to remind people to help the show however you can. Of course, you can always donate to the Libertarian Institute, but we really just ask that people share the show. We host it at the Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. If you like the video version, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, we posted it all three. And then we are up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. I think the show comes out pretty good in audio form, Connor. But if you like maps and we have the articles that we talk about, we display. So there is something that I think is added from the video content. You just don't look at me and Connor talking to each other the whole time. And with that, Connor, let's get into the news today. The first story I think is pretty important, and I wrote this up for the Libertarian Institute. And at the time I wrote it up, there was, of course, the State Department, Antony Blinken made this statement publicly, but there wasn't a whole lot of coverage of this. I think Dave DeCamp said, hey, what do you think about this? And sent me the link from Defense Post. And then other than that, I think I saw Activist Post maybe had an article, but really there wasn't a whole lot out there about this, Connor. So I think this is pretty important. U.S. government created AI tool to hunt Russian disinformation. Washington is launching the Ukraine content aggregator, an artificial intelligence program designed to detect so-called Russian disinformation online. Secretary of State Antony Blinken unveiled the project at the Freedom House 2023 annual award ceremony last week. And this is what Blinken said when announcing this. Russia continues to push a relentless stream of disinformation about its war of aggression against Ukraine. To lie about and cover up horrific abuses it's committed to try to justify committing others. In response, the State Department has developed an AI-enabled online Ukraine content aggregator to collect verifiable Russian disinformation and then to share that with partners around the world. The top diplomat added that the government would be promoting independent media and digital literacy, as well as working with partners in academia to reliably detect fake text generated by Russian chatbots. And so, Connor, this is really interesting. I'm not 100% sure what this thing is going to do. And I think one thing we should be aware of is, we're not sure, I guess, exactly when the State Department is going to roll it out at this point. I'll talk about this in a second, but we were able to shut down a similar kind of program in the past. And so maybe that could still happen. But I worry, Connor, that this thing is going to get rolled out. It's going to be really ineffective, but then it's going to get better. And then it's going to quietly become a problem over time. So it is unclear with which partners the State Department plans to share the AI-marked post, and officials have yet to elaborate on what kind of fake text the programs would target. Journalist Matt Taibbi has documented the deep ties between social media sites and the U.S. federal government in his Twitter Files reporting, which cited a large trove of internal company documents showing the platform suppressed or boosted content based on the requests from officials. And I should note that the story about boosting content did come from Lee Fong and not Matt Taibbi, but it was a part of documents from Twitter and the Twitter Files. So just want to make that note there. The prevailing mainstream narrative about the supposed Russian disinformation polluting American politics arose as a part of the debunked theory that social media posts by the Kremlin-backed troll farm handed Donald Trump his 2016 election victory. In subsequent reporting, investigative journalist Gareth Border found the Russian private sector effort accounted for a minuscule proportion of the election-related output of social media, noting that the threat to the U.S. political system in general and its electoral system in particular is not Russian influence. And so Gareth completely shattered that with his story that was published in Consortium News probably 5 years ago now, Connor. This Russiagate thing has been going on for a long time, but, this Russian disinformation that this was a real problem arose as a part of the many demons of the Russiagate conspiracy theory, Blue Anon. These people came up with all kinds of different ways that Russia interfered in the election. And what they pointed to was about $40,000 of Facebook ads that were purchased by a private Russian company that were about a variety of things, but also have Buff Bernie memes, anti-Hillary memes, and some, I guess, pro-Trump memes, anti-masturbation memes to go along with it. So just a lot of stuff in there, memes about puppies. And Connor, look, I was a content creator back in 2016. I know that's a long time ago now, but remembering back to the days when I still had a Facebook account and you were in the run up to the 2016 election, if you wanted to post a meme on Facebook that was going to get clicks, I got to tell you, the pro-Hillary memes just weren't resonating with the Facebook audience. And that was, the Trump memes and dunking on Hillary is what was popular. And so that's all this, I think, internet research agency, this Russian firm was doing at the time, was just trying to generate clicks. They're just producing clickbait. And, this morphed into this boogeyman of Russian disinformation that the State Department here is trying to pursue in a way that could really, really cut against our freedom of speech. So additionally, a study conducted last year by Graphica and the Stanford Internet Observatory suggested that the social media landscape is teeming with Washington's own disinformation. The researchers uncovered a series of covert campaigns that pushed pro-Western misinformation on Twitter, Facebook, and 5 other social media platforms over a period of nearly 5 years. Still, the U.S. government has repeatedly invoked the supposed threats of Russian disinformation as it seeks to gather power to control what is shared on the internet. In 2022, the Joe Biden administration attempted to create the Disinformation Governance Board under the Department of Homeland Security that was to be headed by Nina Jankowicz, a so-called disinformation expert. However, Jankowicz was later resigned from the DHS amid vocal public backlash against what was to be widely considered as an Orwellian Ministry of Truth, with the new office ultimately scrapped. And Connor, I have to imagine that they're going to take something like NATO has a disinformation page about all these arguments as to why Russia doesn't have an excuse and they weren't provoked in the war in Ukraine. And this is all very, they just attach straw man's, Connor. They say, oh, NATO expansion, this is just defensive. It's a defensive alliance, and they don't mention Afghanistan, Libya, Yugoslavia, or any of these wars that NATO engaged in. And, they say NATO expansion isn't a threat to Russia, but they don't, acknowledge any of the Russian concerns or even statements from high-ranking American officials. So just to wrap up this here, Connor, apparently seeing no irony in his comments during his Freedom House speech. So this is the speech where he announced the AI bot to target Russian disinformation. Blinken went on to warn that AI runs the risk of strengthening autocratic governments, including by enabling them to exploit social media even more effectively to manipulate their people and sow division among and within their adversaries. And so he is describing exactly what they're doing. This is absolutely absurd here, Connor. So let's move on here. I had this very important article that Dave DeCamp just put out as we're recording. Report U.S. preparing for Ukraine to become a frozen conflict. Connor, here we go. The Biden administration is preparing for the war in Ukraine to turn to a frozen conflict for years or possibly even decades, similar to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. U.S. officials have been discussing the possibility, including potential options for where to draw the lines for a frozen conflict that either side would agree not to cross. That reports that the idea of freezing the conflict would be politically palatable long-term result. And this is, I don't know, Connor. I kind of doubt that this is something the U.S. is willing to settle on. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of debate going around in Washington. But just last week, U.S. officials were saying that they are completely against any kind of ceasefire proposed by China because drawing those lines will just give Russia time to prepare for their next offensive. And so I'm not quite sure why they're suddenly now floating this idea, but maybe it's because, as Dave writes here, the administration is considering the possibility because they don't expect Ukraine to regain much territory and its long-awaited counteroffensive. According to Politico, the U.S. is expecting that its sold won't deal a mortal blow to Russia. And Connor, we have been talking about over the past, I guess, week now, that there's potentially some Ukrainian maneuvers going on in Bakhmut. And it seemed maybe what happened is Ukraine retook some territory to help support their retreat. And now the Russian forces, to my understanding, have taken most of the city of Bakhmut. And I don't think it's fallen yet. But in the coming days, at this point, they do expect, I believe, Russia to take over that city. So that probably wasn't a part of the counteroffensive, and I was wrong on my speculation there. It was, a shorter term tactical maneuver for the Battle of Bakhmut and not about Ukraine's overall war effort. Although, maybe they plan to redeploy these forces as a part of their counteroffensive. So, interesting that, and Dave goes on here to say that long-term support would be continuing to arm Ukraine and try to make the country's military more interoperable with NATO. Some NATO members are looking to upgrade Ukraine's status within the alliance. The U.S. and Western NATO members are reluctant to give Kiev a concrete path to membership, but some new guarantees are expected in the future. Maybe this is a way that Kiev sees to pave itself to be able to get membership in NATO, Connor, would be to have a ceasefire, and at which point they would say, well, we're, not technically at war, and then they, try to join the alliance and probably start another war. Anyways, here we go. Next article. Britain, Netherlands agree to build coalition to give Ukraine F-16s. So the British Prime Minister Sunak and the Dutch Prime Minister have agreed to work to form an international coalition to ship American-made F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Connor, we have been talking about this for months, I guess. We have strongly speculated, I would guess, for at least the past 4 months or so, that the U.S., probably since, before December, so that's 6 months now, that it was likely that Ukraine would get Western-made fighter jets. But that would take some time, in part because I don't think the West wanted to reveal their hand too early. And so they must be getting pretty close, Connor, not to being able to deploy these, but to really ramp up the training program in a significant way. And I have seen reports that France now is willing to train Ukrainian pilots. So we'll see what happens, how it develops. I did expect maybe them to play this a little closer, hand here, Connor, and not reveal that they were trying to build the coalition until they were, had everybody lined up and ready to go. But maybe they found that they actually need to, or at least they believe they need to put it out in the public to generate that public pressure to achieve their goal here. Now, next up, Hungary blots aid to Ukraine over blacklisting of Hungarian bank. Hungary on Wednesday said it would continue to block the EU aid to Ukraine due to Kiev's increasingly belligerent attitude. The Hungarian foreign minister said Ukraine won't receive $543 million tranche of aid until it removes Hungary's OTP bank from a blacklist of alleged supporters of Russia's war, arguing against the listing. OTP's Ukrainian branch said it had drastically reduced its presence in the Russian market. And Connor, I'm sure there's a lot of tensions here. I know that for a long time, Hungary had put up a roadblock to Ukraine sitting on in holding different meetings within NATO about admitting Ukraine into the alliance. Bureaucratic, probably not particularly important, but symbolic. And Hungary has been holding that up for years. And recently, NATO just said, well, we're not going to listen to your veto, and we're just going to go ahead and hold those meetings. So I wonder if this is maybe another way for Hungary to try to assert itself, because it has a lot of problems with the language laws and the laws we talk about in Ukraine that target the Russians, the ethnic Russians in that country. Well, I think there's about 150,000 Hungarians that also live in Ukraine, and they feel increasingly discriminated against. Next up, Connor. NORAD detects Russian aircraft in Alaska's Adiz during U.S. drills. North American Aerospace Defense Command, that's NORAD, said Wednesday that it detected and tracked a Russian military aircraft operating in Alaska's Air Defense Identification Zone on May 15th. And Adiz is an area that extends far beyond the territorial waters and airspace where the U.S. wants foreign aircraft to identify themselves. Alaska's Adiz is a massive area that extends near the Russian coast to where Russian aircraft routinely operate. So this sounds like a bigger deal when you read the headline in the mainstream media, but thankfully we had Dave DeCamp writing this up, explaining that it's not like they're buzzing off the coast of Alaska or anything like that, Connor. They're way out in the middle of the sea still, and probably even closer to the Russian coastline than the Alaskan coastline. Next up here, Russia says open to Ukraine peace proposals from Africa and Brazil. On the last show, I talked about these peace proposals made, or this peace offer that was going to be made by African leaders to try to facilitate an end to this war. And Lavrov is saying that they're going to look at the proposals. And so this seems like good news, Connor. It seems the Kremlin position that we're not going to talk until we've achieved our military objectives may be waning some. But, that's yet to be seen. Once these peace proposals start to actually come out, diplomats start to meet, then we'll really understand if Russia is committed to these talks or not. And now we have some good news on the diplomatic end. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the UN-backed Black Sea grain export deal has been extended for another 2 months, a day before it was due to expire, as a result of problems, longstanding issues that Russia has been having with the deal about Western sanctions preventing their grain exports and other foodstuffs from being able to reach global markets. So this is a piece I wrote for the Institute yesterday. UN-backed Black Sea grain export deal receives 2-month extension. So Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has announced that the Black Sea grain export deal designed to keep goods flowing through Ukrainian ports has been extended for another 2 months. Erdogan's statement comes just 1 day before Moscow could have scrapped the agreement over, as I said, these issues that they've been having, despite the technical exemptions from the sanctions on these goods. So Erdogan said, with the efforts of our country, the support of our Russian friends, the contribution of our Ukrainian friends, it was decided to prolong the Black Sea grain deal for 2 more months. And this was during his televised address yesterday. Russia, Ukraine, and the UN then subsequently each confirmed the extension. And we had the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Kubrakov saying that the grain corridor will remain open at least through July 18th. And so since it was negotiated last July, the deal, which was brokered by Ankara as well as the United Nations, has allowed 30.3 million tons of grain and other foodstuffs to be exported through Ukraine's heavily mined Black Sea ports. And that figure includes 625,000 tons of goods used in World Food Program aid operations in several poor and war-torn countries. And several of these are war-torn as a result of American intervention, but Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Yemen. And so it's very critical that this deal remains intact. You have Somalia facing a drought. We just saw the great write-up from Will Porter in our news section about the cost of war projects. New estimate that 4.5 million people have died. I believe 3.7 of those are indirect deaths as a result of things like crippling food insecurity, wasting sickness, the destruction of health services, the environment, public services, and the economy in all these countries as a result of America's post 9/11 wars. So the deal between Russia and Ukraine. Oh, I should just add that this deal has almost fallen through before because of attacks on the Black Sea Fleet that are also encouraged by the Washington-led NATO coalition in the proxy war with Russia. So America's actions, and including refusing to work with Russia on the issues they've been having with the deal, contribute to, or at least make it more likely that the deal will fail. which is horrible and something that we need to really keep an eye on. But the deal between Russia and Ukraine, the world's first and fifth greatest grain exporters, respectively, is critical for the global food supply. In comments to reporters following Erdogan's announcement, we had the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres say these agreements matter for global food security, adding that Ukrainian and Russian products feed the world. Both countries are also top suppliers of barley, fertilizers, sunflower oil, and other affordable foodstuff for developing nations across Asia and Africa. In its statement confirming the extension, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that this is an opportunity to help ensure global food security, not in words, but in deeds, first and foremost to help the countries most in need. The ministry added, our principled assessment of the Istanbul agreements of July 22nd, 2022 has not changed, and the distortions in their implementation should be corrected as soon as possible. So, as I said, Moscow has repeatedly complained that restrictions on payments, logistics, and insurance have been preventing shipments of Russian agricultural goods from reaching global markets. And ostensibly, such products are spared from the Washington-led sanctions blitz on Russia. And the UN has repeatedly pledged, even as a part of the deal originally when it was initially implemented, to work with Western countries to ease these restrictions. However, as we've seen with Iran and many other heavily sanctioned countries, banks and shipping companies are discouraged and extremely hesitant to do any business with heavily sanctioned countries for fear of running afoul of the myriad penalties, that the Treasury Department has laid out as sort of a minefield that these businesses have to walk through. And so UN Chief Guterres has assured that Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN will continue discussing these outstanding issues between the warring parties. He said, looking ahead, we hope that exports of food and fertilizers, including ammonia from the Russian Federation and Ukraine, will be able to reach global supply chains safely and predictably. And then we had Vasa Nebenzia, Russia's ambassador to the UN, remarking that we still do not lose hope that these problems that we are raising will be sorted out. And so the only thing I'd like to add here is about the American and the Ukrainian reaction. So as I said earlier, that some of Ukraine's actions, agitated by the U.S., have jeopardized the security of the deal. And what we saw was, even though Russia has raised these complaints several times and said that they will walk away from the deal at some point if these are not resolved, we had Linda Thomas-Greenfield, America's UN ambassador, saying that we reject this because Russia's grain exports are higher now than they were before the war. But those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and they could be taking other routes, other sea routes, or going overland to China. There's all kinds of different reasons that could be the case. It doesn't mean that the Russians are being dishonest. It's self-evidently true. We've seen this over and over again with countries, as I said, that have been heavily sanctioned by the U.S. And of course, the Ukrainians' whole thing is just saying that Russia is using food as blackmail, and as I said, it's more about it's very important that the UN and Turkey are keeping this deal on life support because it could have fallen through. But obviously, there was some diplomacy put in place, and it's been extended for another 2 months. But the Americans need to do the right thing here, but we know they most likely won't. But hopefully, the deal stays intact because it's obviously very important. All right. So now we're going to move to the Middle East. Congress is again looking out for the interests of the American people and trying to get us out of all these conflicts that we've been mired in, killing millions of people and spending trillions of dollars. Oh, wait, that's not true. So we actually have American lawmakers now introducing a bill to combat Syria normalization. So we were talking last week about how the talks in Congress, again, it's always bipartisan when it comes to these kinds of issues of Iran or Syria. So this is now they were talking about using sanctions to prevent these regional countries from restoring their ties with Syria. So now what they're trying to do, they've introduced a bill to do this, and we're going to lay down the gauntlet and prevent these countries from normalizing with Syria. So this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on May 11th. A bipartisan group of lawmakers in the House have introduced a bill aimed to combat Syria's normalization with regional countries, which would expand sanctions and prohibit the U.S. from establishing diplomatic ties with the government of Bashar al-Assad. The bill was introduced by Representatives Joe Wilson, he's a Republican from South Carolina, of course, Michael McCaul, Republican from Texas, the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, and ultra hawk, Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, and several other members of the House. The legislation comes as a response to Syria being readmitted into the Arab League, which has enraged American officials who want to keep Syria isolated. So this is McCall saying the United States must use all of our leverage to stop normalization with Assad. I am proud to join my colleagues in mandating further sanctions against any form of investment in territory under the control of the Assad regime, and we remain committed to ensuring the Syrian people receive justice. And we know from Alina Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, that this guy is just he's condemning Syrians to a devastated life where 12 million people are facing acute food insecurity. You have 90% of people living below the poverty line with very limited access to electricity, water, transportation, food, fuel, healthcare. And so there's no justice involved. He's just acting on behalf of the American and Israeli access in the Middle East. And so he says, let's see. So the bill, Dave says, the bill seeks to expand the Caesar Act, which of course targets directly construction and engineering sectors. As he's saying, we're blocking any form of investment in the territory under the control of Assad. So they don't. He's explicitly saying, just like Blinken did last in 2021, in the summer of 21, that we are explicitly opposed to this country rebuilding unless there is regime change, even though they killed 500,000 people trying to do that already. So the bill seeks to expand the Caesar Act, which the U.S. used to impose crippling economic sanctions on Syria in 2020. They're designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. The sanctions have had a devastating impact on Syria's civilian population, and the House recently voted overwhelmingly to keep enforcing them following an earthquake that killed thousands of Syrians. I believe only 2 House members voted against that. According to a summary of the bill, the legislation would expand the Caesar Act by plugging loopholes in the original bill, which made it hard to enforce. The bill would, quote, clarify the applicability of current sanctions to Syrian regime airlines and to energy transactions, sending a clear sign to countries normalizing with Assad, which are considering allowing Syrian regime airlines to land in their airports. The legislation would require an annual strategy for 5 years to counter normalization with the Assad regime by countries which have taken steps to normalize with the Assad regime. This is a quote from their statement. It would prohibit any U.S. federal agencies from recognizing or normalizing with any government in Syria led by Bashar al-Assad. Despite Washington's hardline position on normalization, regional countries are still following through with their plans. Last Tuesday, Syria and Saudi Arabia announced that they were resuming diplomatic ties officially for the first time in more than a decade. The following day, Saudi King Salman invited Assad to attend an Arab League summit in Jeddah later this month, and actually Assad arrived in Jeddah today. This is despicable. I mean, preventing the energy transit. They're already attacking, as you've discussed on the show at the beginning of the week. The Israelis and the Americans attacking Iranian oil tankers or seizing them and stealing the oil. You have Israelis attacking well over more than a dozen Iranian oil tankers headed to Syria and Lebanon in the Red Sea over the last between 2021 and the beginning of I guess it was the early part of 2022. I forget exactly, but it was over a dozen. It's a very important Wall Street Journal piece we've referenced many times. But so yeah, and then I guess but they're trying to prevent the Syrian airlines from landing in other countries to prevent them from conducting diplomacy. That's not gonna work. But you could see how callous these policies are, and of course, no word on Israel's constant bombings of the country. And the fact that the U.S. has stolen a third of Syria's territory. Okay. Now we have, the U.S. bombed Syria, as we discussed last week. They said that they claimed it was targeting a senior al-Qaeda member whose name they didn't provide or any other details on who the guy was. And it turns out it's more likely that the U.S. murdered a sheep herder. So this is from Dave DeCamp on May 15th. U.S. military probing reports that it killed a civilian in a recent Syria airstrike. So the U.S. military says it's looking into reports that it killed a civilian in a recent airstrike that it launched in northwest Syria. When CENTCOM, Central Command, first reported the strike on May 3rd, the command claimed that it killed a senior al-Qaeda leader. But CENTCOM did not name the person and released very little detail about the strike. Reports immediately surfaced that the strike had hit a farm and killed a civilian in Syria's northwestern Idlib province. According to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the U.S. launched a drone strike that killed Lufti Hassan Masto, a 60-year-old sheep herder not affiliated with any of the militant groups that we've backed, like the al-Nusra Front or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib province. The Associated Press spoke with Mastro's brother, Mohammed Masto, who said the claims the 60-year-old was affiliated with al-Qaeda were lies. He said, quote, he had nothing to do with the revolution. He had nothing to do with the al-Nusra Front or with the Islamic State. AP also spoke with Fayed Jamil Raji, a neighbor of Masto, who said the man was a civilian. He had a farm with poultry, cows, and sheep. Major John Moore, a spokesman for CENTCOM, said the command is trying to confirm the identity of the person they killed. We are aware of the allegations of a civilian casualty, and the outcome of the confirmation process will inform if further investigation is necessary and how it should proceed. That's a real interesting way of discussing someone you just murdered. The U.S. military is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties or lying about them. The Pentagon is also known for investigating itself and finding no wrongdoing, even in instances of significant civilian deaths, such as the August 2021 Kabul drone strike that killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. All right. Now, the U.S. and Syria are currently engaged in some negotiations. These are currently being mediated by Oman. And this is from a report in The Cradle that Dave wrote up on May 16th at antiwar.com. So the Cradle reported on Tuesday that the U.S. and Syria have been engaged in secret direct negotiations in the Omani capital of Muscat. The report cited senior diplomatic official in the Arab League who said the talks included security figures from both countries and representatives of foreign ministries. Topics discussed in the meetings included the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria and Austin Tice, an American who went missing in Syria in 2012 while working as a freelance journalist. The U.S. claims Tice is alive in Syrian custody, something Damascus has repeatedly denied. When asked if the Cradle report could be confirmed, the State Department told antiwar.com that it was engaged with a number of countries in the region to try and get Tice home. We are engaging extensively to get Austin home. We have pursued every channel we can seek his safe return to his. We have pursued every channel we can to seek his safe return to his family, and will continue to do so. That includes discussing the case with a number of countries in the region, a State Department spokesman said in an email. We will keep working until we see his safe return to the United States. As President Biden said, we are not ceasing our effort to find Austin Tice and bring him home. The spokesperson added, earlier this month, Secretary of State Antony Blinken made similar comments saying the U.S. was engaged with third countries, including Syria. According to the Cradle source, during the talks in Muscat, a U.S. envoy repeatedly confirmed that he has information that Austin Tice is alive in a Syrian army detention center. But the Syrian side insisted that it has no information about Tice, with Damascus expressing its readiness to make all possible efforts to reveal his fate. The Cradle said that the Syrian side, quote, mainly pressed the U.S. to withdraw all of its troops from Syria. The report cited other field sources who claimed the U.S. actually has 2,000 troops in Syria, significantly more than the Pentagon's official figure of 900. I wonder if that includes the contractors that are also there. Every time there's an attack from, they always accuse it's like they always say it's an Iran-backed militia without providing evidence of that. Although it's very possible that could be the case in some instances. But it's, we always hear that a contractor has been killed, or a contractor has been injured, and along with 3 other troops. So that'd be very interesting to see it, because we know that President Trump has even been lied to by his own officials about the actual number of U.S. troops in the country. So why would they be any more truthful with us? But the revelation of the dialogue between Washington and Damascus comes amid a major regional push to normalize relations with the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. Damascus was recently readmitted into the Arab League, a step the U.S. opposes, of course, as Washington prefers to keep Syria isolated and crushed under sanctions, which are designed, as I said, to prevent the country from ever rebuilding after this war. Okay, now, just a quick one here. Syria's Assad to attend Arab League summit for the first time in over a decade. The summit begins tomorrow. As I said, Assad has already arrived in Jeddah. This is from Dave on the 17th. Syria's Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad said Wednesday that Bashar al-Assad, the Syria's president, will attend an Arab League summit this Friday in Saudi Arabia for the first time in over a decade. Earlier this week, Mekdad attended a preparatory meeting for the summit, making him the first Syrian official to attend an Arab League event since Syria was suspended from the bloc in 2011. Mekdad said, "This is a new opportunity for us to tell our Arab brothers that we do not look to the past, but towards the future. Syria was suspended following the outbreak of war in Syria. Many of the bloc's members threw their support behind the failed regime change effort against Assad. But now the majority of Arab nations have accepted that Assad isn't going anywhere, and they're normalizing relations with Damascus." Washington's strong opposition to regional countries upgrading ties with Syria hasn't slowed the momentum. The effort to bring Syria into the Arab League was spearheaded by Saudi Arabia, which also established diplomatic relations with Damascus. Saudi King Salman, as I said, personally invited Assad to come to the summit. Okay, this next piece is about Yemen. From Dave DeCamp on the 11th, Saudi envoy says Yemen peace talks are serious, but unclear when deal will come. So Saudi Arabia's envoy to Yemen said Thursday that all sides are engaged in talks to end the war in Yemen are serious, but the next steps are unclear. So everybody is serious. Serious means everybody is looking for peace. And that's Mohammed Al-Yaber speaking to AFP. He says it's not easy to be clear about next steps. Yaber, he's the envoy for these talks for the Saudis. And he's traveled to Sana'a last month, of course, to hold these in-person talks with the Houthis that were mediated by the Omanis. The negotiations were a significant step, and both sides said good progress was made, but no deals were signed. When we discussed last week, we've seen relief ships with shipments of food and other goods arriving in at Hodeidah. And we've seen these major prisoner exchanges taking place. So there's some good developments still going on. Of course, it's been well over a year since there were any Saudi airstrikes in Yemen or Houthi attacks over the border in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis and the Houthis are expected to soon agree to an extension of a ceasefire, which is meant to pave the way for a lasting political settlement. While no official ceasefire has been in effect since last October, as I said, there haven't been any of these Saudi airstrikes or retaliatory Houthi attacks against Saudi. Now, Yaber tried to characterize Riyadh's role as a mediator between the Houthis and the Saudi-backed Yemeni government, whose leadership is in exile. But Saudi Arabia is a direct party to the conflict, of course, and has been leading the coalition to intervene in Yemen since 2015 with full U.S. backing. Last year, the exiled Yemeni government formed the Presidential Leadership Council in Riyadh, which took power from President Hadi, who fled to Saudi Arabia in 2015 and was on house arrest. Members of the PLC insist that the Saudis are mediating between them and the Houthis. Yaber said the Houthis and the PLC refused to sit together. The Presidential Leadership Council has little power in Yemen, and Southern separatists have added to their problems. So the UAE-backed Southern Transition Council held a meeting on Monday and called for a partition of Yemen to reflect the borders of the previous states of North and South Yemen before they were combined to create the modern borders of the country in 1990. According to the New Arabs, Southern factions met in Aden and signed a national charter that included a clause that called for, quote, the restoration of the state of the South with its political and geographical borders, according to what was before May 22nd, 1990. The Houthis currently control the vast majority of territory that used to be North Yemen. And Dave has a great map for people to check out to see what it would look like if that partition was implemented as it once was. Okay. The next story is about we've got the Pentagon wants to work with the Israelis on joint planning for attacks on Iran. And believe it or not, the Israelis are concerned that this doesn't go far enough, that it may tie their hands. So this is from Dave DeCamp on the 17th. Axios reported Wednesday that the Biden administration wants to make a strong diplomatic push for a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Oh, excuse me, I jumped ahead. We're going to do this story on the potential. Biden wants Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize ties before the end of the year. It's very important to the Biden administration. So let me do this first before we get to the Israel stuff. So, okay. So this is from Dave on the 17th. Axios reported Wednesday that the Biden administration wants to make a strong diplomatic push for a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel before the end of the year. Any potential deal could come at a steep cost to the U.S., as Riyadh is seeking stronger military support from Washington in exchange for establishing diplomatic ties with Israel. The Wall Street Journal reported in March, and this was I believe a day before the Saudis and the Chinese and the Iranians announced their deal that was brokered by the Chinese in Beijing, where they were normalizing ties and reopening their consulates and embassies. But the Wall Street Journal had reported in March that the Saudis were seeking security guarantees from the U.S. and assistance in establishing their own nuclear program. The U.S. and Israel have been hoping to build on the normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain and want Saudi Arabia to be next. Of course, as we've been talking about for years now, a major aspect of this plan with the Abraham Accords is to build this foundation for essentially a NATO-style alliance encircling Iran. which makes a ton of money for the military-industrial complex. It helps Israel, set the precedent as they have during the Trump years with the phony peace deals, I should say, with the UAE and Bahrain, where they throw the Palestinians under the bus, condemning them to further generations of suffering under apartheid, and of course, in exchange for welfare for the military-industrial complex and these arms sales to these Gulf dictatorships, and and it's encircling Iran and basically setting the stage for a major regional war with Iran, and so Saudi Arabia's steps to normalize with Iran and Syria blindsided the U.S., as William Burns told Mohammed bin Salman recently when he went to Riyadh. And this, of course, puts MBS in a good position to extract further concessions from the United States. We had Jake Sullivan visiting Saudi Arabia last weekend, and they apparently discussed the prospect of an Israeli normalization deal with MBS, which we know Lindsey Graham and a lot of these and the Biden administration are very eager. They want to pull this off. So a U.S. official told, which will be very difficult, of course, given the nature of especially the current Israeli regime. I mean, things are only getting worse for the Palestinians. There's been obviously the bombing of Gaza recently, and they're bombing their neighbors left and right, whether it's Syria and even Lebanon earlier this year. And, there's just politically no way, even if Saudi Arabia wanted to, that they could normalize with the Israelis, although I guess they're trying to use all that leverage in order to get these concessions from the U.S. But a U.S. official told Axios that MBS said he doesn't want to take any more incremental steps toward warming relations with Israel, but instead work toward one big package that will include U.S. deliverables like stronger military cooperation. Two U.S. officials said it would be in Saudi Arabia's interest to reach a deal during the Biden administration, as Democrats in Congress would likely oppose giving Riyadh more military support under a Republican administration. It's very interesting to see, when Sullivan went to Saudi Arabia and they quote reviewing the progress of the peace talks that have been mediated by the Omanis and some of these the UN's assistance in helping arrange some of these prisoner swaps. Just like we've heard previously from other Biden officials speaking to the Saudis, they kind of there is this whole idea like, well, we'll give you all this much stronger military cooperation, and even discussing things like security guarantees, and all that does is you got to wonder, what are the American officials telling the Saudis privately in these meetings about Yemen? Do you want to kick the war off again? Because obviously this, they're not the problem. The Americans don't necessarily have a problem with the carnage and mass murder of close to 400,000 Yemenis, and most of those are children and babies, or children under 5 years old. That doesn't bother them at all. What bothers them is that Saudi Arabia is normalizing with Iran and not Israel. Among other things that Saudi has done, taking a more independent foreign policy recently. But back to, we have more news on Israel targeting Iran. So the U.S. wants to conduct joint military planning with the Israelis aimed at Iran. And this is a piece from Dave up at antiwar.com today, published yesterday on the 17th. The U.S. has proposed to Israel to conduct joint military planning on potential attacks on Iran. This is from an Axios report from Wednesday. The report cited U.S. and Israeli officials who said the idea was proposed a few weeks ago during recent visits to Israel by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley, CENTCOM Commander General Eric Kurilla, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Israel is known for conducting covert attacks inside Iran and has stepped up its threats to launch an overt military attack against the Islamic Republic in recent years, although it's not clear if Israel could pull off such an operation without U.S. support. The U.S. and Israel have been stepping up military cooperation and held their largest ever joint military exercises in January. U.S. officials told Axios that the proposal for joint planning against Iran is unprecedented and can significantly boost U.S.-Israel military ties even more. According to the Axios report, Israel didn't reject the idea, but asked for clarifications regarding what joint military planning actually means in practice, including whether this process stays in the realm of intelligence and scenarios or extends into the realm of joint operations, a senior Israeli official said. The report said that Israeli officials have taken the proposal with suspicion, worrying that it could tie Israel's hands, in quotes. A U.S. official said that the idea is not about planning any kind of joint U.S.-Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear program, however. But a U.S. official also told Axios that the proposal was meant as a reassurance that the U.S. backs Israel and is not meant to tie their hands. The U.S. official added that such joint planning means that each side shares its plans for different contingencies, and both sides can discuss ways to better deal with different scenarios that could develop regarding Iran's activities in the region. An Israeli official said that Israel is looking for the U.S. to clarify exactly what joint planning means. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan tried to calm Israeli concerns in a speech at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy 2 weeks ago, saying, "We have made clear to Iran that it can never be permitted to obtain a nuclear weapon. As President Biden has repeatedly reaffirmed, he will take the actions that are necessary to stand by this statement, including by recognizing Israel's freedom of action." So again, giving Israel a green light to do whatever it wants with Iran. He's speaking at an AIPAC spinoff think tank set up by Martin Indyk, an advisor to Bill Clinton, and really the architect of the dual containment policy of Iraq and Iran in the 1990s, which killed hundreds of thousands of people and was one of the main reasons given by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri for the 9/11 attacks. Okay. So U.S.-Iran tensions have been soaring since indirect negotiations to revive the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA fell apart at the end of last year. The U.S. announced last week that it was increasing its military presence in the Persian Gulf after Iran seized 2 tankers, which came after the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil and stole the cargo. And the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet has announced that they're working to increase the rotation of ships and aircraft that patrol the Strait of Hormuz. Okay. Now and this is, it's interesting that the Axios got this scoop, of course, because this comes only, less than 2 months after Mark Milley told Congress that the U.S. wanted to start directly targeting the IRGC in Syria and presumably elsewhere, very harshly over time, he said. And, of course, we know last year there was this massive assassination campaign the Israelis carried out in Iran and several drone strikes as well. So they could be kicking off something here with Iran soon. The rest of this is going to be on Palestine. So Egypt brokered a ceasefire to end Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip after 5 days and dozens of civilians killed. Israel and Palestinian leadership in the Gaza Strip agreed to an Egyptian-mediated ceasefire that took effect at 10 p.m. local time on Saturday. And this is from Middle East Eye on the 13th. So Israel agreed to the ceasefire while rejecting the Islamic Jihad's demand that Israel end all targeted assassinations. Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported, citing an official Israeli source. Netanyahu's office thanked Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi for Egypt's, quote, resolute efforts to broker a truce. The Israeli announcement added that quiet will be answered with quiet, and if Israel is attacked or provoked, it will do whatever is necessary to defend itself. For its part, Cairo called on all sides to adhere to the agreement. Egypt's Al Quaira News television channel reported the two sides will abide by the ceasefire, which will include an end to targeting civilians, home demolition, and an end to targeting individuals immediately when the ceasefire goes into effect. A text of the agreement seen by Reuters read. Missile strikes from both sides were reported in the minutes before the 10 p.m. deadline, with Israel's military announcing it had hit 6 operational command posts of the Islamic Jihad group, a resistance faction in Gaza. And following the deadline, however, a fragile quiet took hold, with the joint command and umbrella body of armed groups in the Strip, including Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, warning Israel against any further attacks. The resistance forces in Gaza are concluding the conflict united and resolute, and caution the enemy against returning to the policy of targeted killings. We are ready with a firm hand on the trigger, and if you return, we will return, the group said in a statement after the truce set in. There have been mounting calls for a ceasefire to be agreed, including from Israel's closest ally, the United States. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, in a call to the Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, stressed the urgency of reaching a ceasefire agreement in order to prevent any further loss of civilian life, the State Department said. Saturday marked the 5th day of Israel's bombardment of Gaza, which has left 33 Palestinians dead. Israel's offensive, dubbed Operation Shield and Arrow, also killed six members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the second largest armed group in Gaza after Hamas. In addition to the nearly 36 deaths, the airstrikes in Gaza have led to major damage to civilian infrastructure and left many homeless. Mayad al-Bahri, a resident of Gaza's Bet Lahia, recounted to Middle East Eye the terrifying moments when airstrikes hit his neighborhood. He said, "I was sleeping when my wife woke up to flee as Israel had warned our neighbor's house, the Banat family. Me and my neighbors had no choice but to flee. Men, women, young and old were screaming. The scene was terrifying. We fled far away to a house where our relatives live." And of course, Gaza is so small. It's one of the most densely populated places on the planet, 25 by 5 miles with over 2 million people packed inside and under blockade and siege. He noted that Israel had bombed the house with a high explosive rocket, which caused heavy damage. Meanwhile, officials in Gaza warned on Saturday that it would have no choice but to close down the besieged territory's only power plant unless Israel reopened its border crossing to let in emergency fuel. The state-run Wafa agency reported the power plant sustained heavy damage during Israel's latest bombardment. A hospital in central Gaza had been damaged as a result of a strike on a house next to it. And the Gaza Electricity Authority warned that the area could face critical power outages within 72 hours due to a lack of diesel fuel from the sole power plant in the enclave. Israel has completely closed the crossings connecting it to Gaza since Tuesday, halting the entry of essential goods into the coastal enclave. Israel unilaterally withdrew troops and settlements from Gaza in 2005, but has maintained an air, sea, and land blockade ever since. Gaza already suffers from a chronic electricity deficit due to the blockade, resulting in increasing fragile living conditions for the population, according to the UN Office of Coordination for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And Israel is still, they've killed more people in the West Bank recently. This is from the 13th. From Middle East Eye again, Israeli forces killed 2 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank on Saturday, and several were wounded during an arrest raid. The men were identified by the Palestinian Health Ministry as Said Jihad Shaker Massa, who's 32, and Adnam Wasim Youssef al-Araj, who was 19, from the Balata refugee camp in Nablus. Israeli forces had conducted a raid on a house near Nablus to arrest suspects, according to witnesses. The Israeli media outlet Haaretz said the Israeli army later admitted it was unable to carry out the arrest operation through, and that an exchange of fire had occurred. The Palestinians killed were not suspects. The Israeli military was seeking, the army said. Palestinian media outlet Arab 48 reported an eyewitness account from photojournalist Jamal Rayyan, who said the 2 men were shot by snipers with bullets straight to the head, and they posed no threat to Israeli forces. At least 150 Palestinians have now been killed by Israeli fire this year, including the 33 killed in Gaza since Tuesday. And of course, Nablus, a week or I guess 2 weeks ago, there was another raid on a house where they had suspected that there were members of Hamas or one of the armed factions or one of the resistance groups that had killed a family of 3 British Israeli settlers in the Jordan Valley. And then they had gotten down to Nablus, and the Shin Bet and the other security forces went in, surrounded this house, and then just blew it up with a shoulder-fired rocket launcher. And so it's just, and they murdered 3 people too. I mean, and it was very difficult to even identify who they killed from the the medics that were there. And obviously, as usual, they prevent them from getting in to help people. But okay, so the last story I have on Palestine. This is from today. There's more continuing attacks on journalists and Palestinians in Jerusalem in the lead up to the Flag Day march that the Israelis are carrying out, commemorating the occupation and seizing of East Jerusalem in the 67-day war. So this is from Middle East Eye. Jerusalem Palestinians assaulted as Israeli ministers joined divisive flag march. Israeli police officers and ultranationalists assaulted Palestinians and journalists on Thursday as far-right ministers and lawmakers joined the divisive flag march in Jerusalem. Marchers pelted stones at a Middle East Eye reporter and other journalists covering the gathering in the Damascus Gate area near the Old City. At least 2 journalists were hit in the head and wounded. Dozens of participants were carrying the black flag of the racist far-right Lahava group while chanting, "Your village will be burned." Elsewhere, ultranationalists marching through the Old City's Muslim quarter beat Palestinian residents, leading to some scuffles. Israeli police intervened by assaulting Palestinians who were already under attack. A Palestinian activist, Iyad Abu Sanaya was arrested after yelling at police for failing to protect Palestinians. Meanwhile, thousands of Israelis continued to flock to the Damascus Gate Plaza as part of the annual march, which is held on the Jerusalem Day holiday commemorating the occupation of East Jerusalem in 1967. The event is associated with violence against Palestinians and the, quote, display of incitement, Jewish dominance, and racism, according to an Israeli NGO called Amim. Among the participants on Thursday were far-right National Security Minister Itmar Ben-Gvir, Minister of Finance Bezalel Smotrich, and Transport Minister Miri Regev. Ben-Gvir said, there are tens of thousands of people here, thank God. Jerusalem is ours forever. Limor Son Har Melech, a lawmaker in Ben-Gvir's far-right Jewish Power Party, arrived at another point in the march, telling the Times of Israel she was participating to, quote, celebrate our victory over the Arabs. Under heavy security, marchers at Damascus Gate were seen chanting racist slogans, waving the Israeli flag, and dancing as more people were expected to join. Israeli police deployed some 3,000 officers to secure the rally, which is meant to demonstrate Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. Israeli snipers were reportedly seen stationed across the old city's walls while police surveillance drones were flying over the crowds. All roads leading to Damascus Gate were blocked to journalists and Palestinians. A Middle East Eye reporter was denied access by Israeli police despite showing them a press card, forcing her to travel further to enter from another road. Another flag march that took place earlier in the day in Lod, a city in central Israel that is home to a large Palestinian population. Palestinians staged counter rallies in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, flying the Palestinian flag. Protesters near the fence separating Gaza and Israel were dispersed by Israeli soldiers using tear gas. In previous years, Israeli participants in the flag march have assaulted Palestinians and attacked, spat on, and graffitied Palestinian businesses and homes on their route. They also chanted slogans such as "Death to Arabs," "The second Nakba is coming," and "Muhammad is dead," referring to Islam's prophet. Earlier in the day, Israeli settlers and politicians broke into Al-Aqsa Mosque as part of the Jerusalem Day celebrations. One person was filmed insulting the Prophet Muhammad while inside the mosque courtyards. Several lawmakers were in their ranks, including Negev and Galilee Development Minister Yitzhak Wasserloff, who belongs to the Jewish Power Party. 3 MPs and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, Dan Eloz, Amit Halevi, and Ariel Kellner also took part. The Jordanians have condemned the storming and warned that the provocative march could lead to an escalation in Jerusalem. Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967 and annexed it in 1980 in a move that has never been recognized by the international community, and Israel's control of the city violates several principles under international law, which stipulates that an occupying power has no sovereignty in the territory it occupies and cannot make any permanent changes there. So even though there's a ceasefire after the bombing of Gaza and all these killings, this is the sort of thing that could spark another war again, or another, several days of fighting between and it's hard to call it fighting. I mean, the casualties are so lopsided, and the rockets, the Palestinians compared to the Israelis are essentially disarmed. So it's just another canned hunt. But as we saw in 2021, these attacks on Al-Aqsa and on the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem or Palestinians living in the West Bank, there's really very few ways for the Palestinians to retaliate except through armed resistance. They're murdered when they protest peacefully, as we saw in the Great March of Return protests in Gaza. And so Hamas may retaliate if this situation gets worse here. But this is just the latest out of Jerusalem today. So we'll get back to more on this next week.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the update, and we will be back with more episodes next week.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.